Hey, hi, hello, everybody. As always, I don't start the bulk of the conversation until about 5 after the top of the hour. So please just tune in, chill out, see what's up, chill in the chat, do whatever for 5 minutes. Again, I'm gonna keep making these little announcements until I actually start. I don't start the bulk of the conversations and the presentations until 5 minutes after the hour. So if you're in the central time zone, I will start at 5:05. Again, for lovely viewers who might be dropping in on the recording or in the middle of this dead silence, we start at 5 after the top of the hour, so 5:05 if you're in the central time zone. All right, we'll be starting here in about a minute. So if you are just tuning in, just give me another minute and we will get the show on the road as always. Okay. All right, lovely people. It is 5:05 Central Time, 6:05 if you're in the Eastern Time, 4:05 if you're in the Mountain Time, and 3:05 if you're in the Pacific time. So, I currently don't see that there's anybody watching at the moment, which is a-okay for me because I know people will drop in on the recordings and will probably drop in the middle of the live, so that's okay. We'll just go ahead and get started here. So, welcome everybody to the second episode of my 12-week series called Inside the Criminal Mind, where I review episodes of certain episodes of Criminal Minds and go over the characteristics and behaviors of the main criminals in each episode, kind of touch base on some topics that are embraced within the episode and how we could have potentially avoided this type of behavioral development from happening in the first place. So let's move on and figure it out, shall we? Okay. So, as always, it's the same thing. We're going to start with the introduction of me, myself, and my business, a synopsis of the episode, probable relevant theories, criminal prevention, and the conclusion. So far, so good. All right. Personally, if you know me from Instagram, whenever I was doing my Instagram lives, you know me as Sharissa or Eradication Writer. You might follow Eradication Wellness on Instagram. You might follow Eradication Writer on Instagram. Either way, that's where I do most of my promotions. I decided to move everything over to YouTube just because I wanted to be able to use a streaming service. Or not a streaming service. I wanted to be able to use a streaming software, and I wanted to be able to use PowerPoint. And because I really like using PowerPoint. So that's why I'm here. I've had my own mental health journey. I've had my own experiences with mental health. Like I said, I'm going to say it in every single episode just for people who might be jumping in to the middle of the series and don't know who I am or what I do. I've had my own struggles with mental health, and I've had, it's been up and down. It's a roller coaster, as with anybody who has experienced troubles with their mental health. It's always a roller coaster. It's nonstop. But the thing is that it should be normalized. Mental health is something that everybody has, even if you don't struggle with it per se. We all have mental health. Which brings me to my mission in business and life. I ultimately want to normalize the mental health conversation. Mental health is something that I've always been super passionate about. It falls right in line with psychology, and that is where my passion lies. Like, my true passion literally resides with the bulk of psychology and the research behind it, because it truly explains how we develop and the way that we behave, the decisions that we make with our lives. And it really shows psychological growth, mental growth, emotional growth, and things in that aspect. So for me, this is so much more than just my passion or my hobby. This is something that I plan on turning into my life's work. Sorry, my hair is not cooperating. Anyways, so why this series? Criminal behavior can be related to societal issues. A lot of times, it brings back into that whole conversation of the bad seed. Can someone be truly bad or rotten right out of the womb? Or is it more of an influence of the environmental factors, the external factors surrounding a person as they're being raised up within society? There's a lot of different ways that we can look at something, and it can be a lot more than just how someone was raised. It can even be their later experiences in life that can truly affect the decisions that they make and the things that they do with their life. So, it can be something as simple as you struggle with depression. You didn't have a bad childhood or anything. Someone might be struggling with depression. They end up finding themselves in the wrong crowd, and then that crowd ends up letting them and enabling them to make poor decisions within their life. So it can be troublesome. And it's, like I said, it's not something that has to happen during childhood necessarily. but a lot of times it is. But even as adults, it can be the same thing. It can just be the fact that we might have been struggling with our mental health and we found ourselves feeling vulnerable. And so we found solace in a crowd that didn't actually want the best for us. So, it really falls into a societal issue. So this series is basically giving examples of behavior and that can create multiple perspectives. So, whenever you look at, usually whenever we see someone doing something wrong, we wonder, what is wrong with that person? I mean, hopefully we as a society can change that immediate response to something a little bit more productive and supportive. But majority of the time we're raised whenever we see people do something wrong and we're like, what is wrong with that person? Why did they do that? Like, who in their right mind thinks to do X, Y, and Z because it's against the law or whatever? So this is something that can really help us look at different perspectives and how people end up making poor decisions and how we can avoid that. So this episode is going over the episode titled Riding the Lightning. Older folks might immediately know exactly what it's referring to, but riding the lightning is a term for being sentenced to death by electric chair or by electrocution, and that is what riding the lightning means. So, Sarah Jean Dawes and Jacob Dawes, they're both on death row in this case. They've killed many teens and one child, I'll get into some details with that. Sarah Jean Dawes and Jacob Dawes, she was married to Jacob. Sarah was married to Jacob. Jacob ended up killing 18 plus teenaged Caucasian women in various ways, and then burying their body. Majority of them were buried underneath their house, I think, or underneath Sarah's mother's house. I do want to preface before I go any further, trigger warning for anybody who might be triggered by sexual abuse, sexual assault, or mention of sexual assault. So, before I go any further, I had to make sure I put that out there. Yes, so Jacob he's considered a sexual psychopath, but we're going to get more into that later. This episode plays on the ideals of the death penalty and wrongful conviction. Both of them were sentenced to execution through electrocution, I guess. The electric chair, riding the lightning. And yeah, so eventually the criminal minds, the BAU, they get called in to figure out where is Sarah's son. Well, Sarah and Jacob's son. They ended up having a son before they were arrested who was 2 years old, and he went missing, and he was presumed dead. This is happening. This takes place in Florida, which, as we know, in Florida they love to go for the death penalty in these sorts of cases. So there was no actual proof that Sarah actually killed her son, but she took the hit anyways and confessed to it. And there's a reason for it. So we'll get into that. And then, yeah, it turns out that Sarah Jean Dawes was actually innocent, but sadly, it doesn't actually end up panning out in the way that we want to see it. I just had a huge release of energy. Got really lightheaded. Okay. So let's get into the details of this. So like I said, Sarah Jean Dawes was known as the Ice Queen. Apparently, that's what they opened the episode with as the BAU is making their way into Florida. She's on the death penalty. She's going to end up being electrocuted. She's going to get the electric chair. Her husband, Jacob Dawes, was the one who he was actually convicted of killing 18 plus, like I said, teenaged Caucasian women. And in that episode, it ended up, I think they said 14 or something, but then they ended up uncovering more bodies in other places and whatnot. So, it ends up being kind of a really interesting case, because then you're like, okay, obviously there's something weird going on here. The key characteristics with Sarah Jean, well, you don't really get this sense that she's like a killer. You don't really get the sense that she murdered her son, even though that's what the story is. The story is that Jacob told her that she needed to take care of their son, meaning that she needed to kill him and get rid of the body, because he served a liability at that point, because they were being questioned by the police, and Jacob had killed so many women at this point. So it was kind of, there's some weird little instinctual things that's happening throughout this episode. You get the sense that she's peaceful, kind, and respectful. So she, it's kind of hard to tell, why is she in prison? Then you end up realizing that there was no proof that she actually killed her son. They don't know where his body is. They're trying to get it out of her where his body is. And then, they end up figuring out that she didn't kill him. And she still served. They found her guilty. She's on death row. She's literally facing death for something that she didn't do. And so anyways, going into Sarah and Jacob's past leading to the present. So Sarah's father was ex-military, very strict. There is not enough information within the episode that states whether she was abused by her father or not. Basically, two of the agents went to her mother's house, met with her mother, asked if they, basically how she was raised, if she was abused, what happened, had she ever showed weird psychopathic tendencies before. It's one of those things. Then, she ends up getting married to Jacob Dawes. He has major control issues. It turns out he was sexually abused by his mother. And, obviously, which I'm going to get into that I think that formed a sort of Oedipal attachment. And, where he really wanted these things to happen, or with the way that his mother abused him, it messed with his mind. Obviously, when things like that happen, you kind of get the positioning or the ideas kind of wrong in your head about, what's appropriate and what's not. Obviously, if your mother is sexually abusing you, I can imagine that would be kind of, my words are just escaping me, but that would be traumatic, I think. And that would really kind of just mess up your train of thought. What is this supposed to mean? But yeah, so this ended up leading to Jacob needing absolute control over his victims. And that basically made Sarah a victim, ultimately. I have my little notes here that I took as I was watching the episode. Sarah's mom believed that she was raised just fine, even though her father was super strict. She was skeptical if Sarah was even actually abused, but she was also heavily drinking in the episode when the agents were talking to her. So, there was a lot of kind of dodginess whenever they were asking her questions. Sarah had nothing to do with the teenagers that were killed by Jacob, because I don't even think that, I think they mentioned that she had no idea, really, because that would have ruined the fantasy for Jacob. Jacob had this fantasy that his abuses happened to him in private whenever he was a child. So in order for him to recreate the same feeling, he has to be alone with each of his victims, and no one else can know about it, because, whenever he was a child, him and his mother, it was probably their little private little secret. Obviously, it's not appropriate for mothers to have sexual relationships with their sons. So, it's kind of one of those mommy's dirty little secret or something. And so yeah, that made him turn into a sexual psychopath. And that made Sarah his victim. And something that was super interesting to me was that his ultimate end game with this was that, he's going to make Sarah die with him, even though she didn't do anything. She didn't even kill her son. So, like, that's just one of those, it's another one of those things that's like, wow, how could someone do this? How could someone like really have that much control over somebody to make them do such a thing, like confess to killing someone when they didn't and end up on death row and literally have their life at stake for something that they didn't do? Jacob's childhood sexual abuse spurred his control over younger victims, which I literally just said like a couple minutes ago. He has to be alone to fulfill that fantasy. So that right there shows that more than likely Sarah had no idea about these things happening. And then obviously whenever he instructed her to take care of her son or their son, I honestly don't think that she would have been able to kill him in the first place. But since there was no evidence, they didn't know where her son was, who her son was at this point, I guess Florida felt like they had enough evidence to convict her. So, moving on. Is there any questions on that? Because that's kind of a lot. So, like, what happened? How could this have been prevented, or could it have been prevented? I'm actually gonna get on this site here. I looked up the Jacob Dawes thing on the fandom for this, and they have his little profile, and it says a psychiatric evaluation of Dawes done during his imprisonment diagnosed him as a sexual psychopath who craved power, manipulation, and control. He was incapable of guilt or remorse, and he saw Mason, which is actually Sarah Dawes, as merely a possession that he could dominate like his victims. Like I already said, human sexuality is a complex dynamic consisting of three components: biological, physiological, and emotional. Dawes' emotional needs were formed by his mother's long-term emotional and sexual abuse, which formed the template of his love map and resulted in his disorder. As Dawes was alone during the abuse he has suffered, he would logically need to be alone with his victims while torturing them to properly fulfill his fantasies. So, that I feel like says a lot. And this is basically the same, it's the exact same aspects as last week's episode. It's, things happened to Jacob whenever he was a child. So that this created the confusion in normative relationships, like instead of actually being equals in a relationship, he had to exercise control. He had to take advantage and do things to his victims that you wouldn't actually have in relationships. They don't go into detail about the details of him and Sarah's relationship leading up to all of this. We just know that she obviously had no idea about the girls being murdered, or if she did, he probably threatened her to keep her mouth shut. Just because we usually see that type of behavior come from psychopaths, regardless if they're sexual psychopaths or not. And this plays into Erikson's stages of psychosocial development. Whenever we think about that, I'm actually going to pull up a little graph about that, because I think it could make a lot of sense here. If I can find it, here we go. Depending on what stage it was that the sexual abuse happened, and honestly, it could be for the early childhood period, because that's where it's autonomy versus shame and doubt. Whenever it's maldeveloped, it's compulsion. Compulsion is whenever you have to do something. It's with Dahmer's with his victims. It was a compulsion. It was something that he couldn't ignore. It was something that he had to do. And that kind of makes sense in this predicament, because he had this compulsion to lure these teenage girls, it's one of those things, telling them that he has certain things. Now I remember the details of this episode. Okay, I literally just watched this yesterday, by the way. Sarah did know about these girls, but yeah, because she's the one who helped lure them. And then whenever they would show up, then it would just be Jacob. And yeah, I'm not going to go into like any gritty details, but yeah. So, yeah, the compulsion. Obviously, Jacob had to do this. He felt like he had to do this. Sexual psychopath is something that isn't, I don't even know how to describe it. It's just not something that we can, if once you hit that point, it's kind of hard to go back. It's like Ted Bundy. He truly didn't see himself as that killer. And that could have also been like narcissism, but that's a different subject. Right turn, left turn. Anyways, so yeah, Jacob's childhood wasn't the best. Obviously, it didn't create the best environment for him to actually grow up, and it caused that confusion, which eventually caused that compulsion. And then like even if it was in like other periods of life, like during the infancy period, it could have been trust versus mistrust. Obviously, he probably trusted his mom. And there's also like Freudian stages get into this, and that's also where the whole Oedipus theory comes in. I kind of feel like it could have been a bit of an Oedipal complex, an Oedipus complex in this sort of situation, because his mom was heavily involved. And usually when things like that happen, then they end up becoming more extrapolated. Except in this case, he didn't really have mommy issues. Like these issues transformed into something where he needed to have absolute control. And he probably found it easiest to control teenagers or teenaged girls instead of older women. So we also look at the lack of intervention. Obviously, if he never received help during this time period, he had no support. Depending on how long this sexual relationship with his mother lasted, when it started, how many years it went on, when it ended, like there's no telling, because they don't really talk about the details of that. They only kind of touch base on it, which still makes sense. It still explains how he could develop sexual psychopathy, but yeah, therapy could have potentially stopped this from this development from even happening. If only he would have had someone from the outside to reach out and be like, hey, let's get you out of this situation and get you into a healthier situation. But then again, I will admit that sometimes therapy is not 100% the answer. It's not going to fix the problem completely. It takes so much more, other than just receiving therapy. It also has to be a personal choice at the same time. So, honestly, the criminal prevention traits that we look at, it's going to be probably the same in almost every episode, because majority of the time these are things that happened in the past that cultivated these sort of behaviors and actions and manipulations and different outward expressions. So really, it's just something that it's just good to keep in mind. You gotta consider the surroundings of how people are raised sometimes, because that can really explain a lot. Like that can really explain certain behaviors. So anyways, I'm just like repeating myself. Anyways, this is a short one this week. Conclusion. So yeah, this whole perspective, I felt like crying at the end of this episode, but then I cry over everything. They ended up figuring out who her son was. She had a picture of his, like a newspaper clipping of him as a teenager on the back of one of her paintings while she was in death row. One of the agents ended up getting a hold of that, and they figured out who he was and where he was. Turns out she didn't kill her son. She basically portrayed this whole like Moses situation. If anybody is familiar with the Bible, and that Moses ended up getting sent down a stream in a little basket, just because it would be safer for him to be somewhere else. And that's essentially what Sarah did with her son, Riley. She ended up giving him to a family that she cleaned houses for, and basically just let them take the child. And obviously they changed his name and everything, and he was growing up to be a really good, healthy, smart, intelligent child. He was, I think he played like the cello or something, that was the picture in the newspapers. So ultimately that's why, she felt that that's the only thing that she needed to do. She had to make sure that he was going to be safe no matter what. Agent Gideon is the one who found it, and he tried so hard to get her off of death row. He didn't want her to be wrongly convicted, because that's what she was. She was wrongly convicted. She didn't kill her son. She just gave him away and then played it off as she killed him, because, she didn't want Jacob to end up going after her son because he was a liability. So, she ended up choosing to just take her death penalty. She had the option of knowing that her son was alive and okay, and letting the world know that. And she chose to just let it go, because at this point, he's already well established in another family, in another life. He more than likely didn't have any recollection of the life before. So, I'm sure she just didn't want to have to put that on him. And I can understand that. I can completely understand that. So she was executed at the end of the episode. And I think that kind of says a lot. That says a lot about her character as a mother. I think, because, she had the ultimate sacrifice. She ended up giving away her own life just to make sure that her son would have an equally healthy life. Not equally healthy, but to have a better life than he could have if he would have known the truth, potentially. There's no telling how he would have reacted. But, research can definitely make a few predictions. Again, most criminal behavior could have been prevented with proper mental health intervention. Most of the time. I'm going to keep going on this subject. This whole topic, it definitely makes you look at the criminal system. I don't believe in the death penalty, and I'll say that openly. I don't care. I feel like that's the easy way out for most criminals, for people who do end up getting the death penalty. And then in other cases, I feel like it's like cruel and unusual punishment. But again, who am I? I'm only a millennial, right? So Sarah Jean chose to take her execution knowing that she didn't kill her son. It gave her peace of mind that he'll have a normal life. She knew that the family that she gave him to was better off. They had, they're more financially stable. They were more emotionally stable, at least from what the audience can see in this episode. But, it's definitely something. She had to make that ultimate sacrifice, and that's a hard decision to make. So ultimately, that's it. And it was really sad. And basically, it teaches us that, don't be a parent unless you're ready to be a parent. Or be prepared to have to make really hard decisions. Like, literally having to choose life and death for the safety of your own child. Which I hope that no one ever has to go through something like that. And yes, this is a fictional story, but we do know that Criminal Minds episodes are usually modeled after real life events. So, there could actually be some sort of truth to it. And now I'm curious, and I'm going to Google it while I'm live. So yeah, apparently the Dawes, Jacob and Sarah Dawes, were based off of the real life English killers, Fred and Rosemary West. I think I can, no? Ah, yay, okay. I did it. Okay, sorry guys. So yeah, obviously this isn't like a legit type of thing, but it does talk about real life English killers. Fred and Rosemary West appear to be the inspiration for the Dawes. Fred raped and murdered multiple girls and young women from the 1960s to the 1980s. Rosemary, his second wife, participated in his crimes and also killed her husband's 8-year-old daughter from a previous relationship. So, obviously, this was based on a true story, but they took some details and they probably changed them for the political aspect of it, wrongful convictions and the death penalty. Obviously, some states still, they don't believe in the death penalty. They don't allow the death penalty. Oklahoma, where I currently reside, they love the death penalty. They just executed some people literally this month, and they're going to execute another person next month. But they do it by lethal injection. So, certain states that do have the death penalty, some of them prefer to do lethal injection. Some prefer to do the electric chair. Some still do the firing squad. Like, I think that Timothy McVeigh, which was the bomber for in the Oklahoma City federal building, I believe he got the death penalty by firing squad, which I think is kind of interesting. That's really weird to me. Like, does anybody watching have any weird stories or comments about the death penalty? I've read a lot of stories about the death penalty, and they're super sad. Especially with the lethal injection. For, I don't know, anybody who might not be aware of lethal injection, in Oklahoma, they were having some issues with their lethal injection executions last year. It was a huge deal. Actually, I think it started, it's in 2021 into 2022. The lethal injection cases were kind of interesting because there were botched executions, and basically the person ended up suffering a lot more. And I get it. The perspective in Oklahoma when it comes to the death penalty is that, hey, they did a horrible crime, they deserve it. But I just don't feel like that's our power to do. That shouldn't be a part of our power. Anyways. So yeah. I'm going ahead of myself. But so yeah, that's the episode that's the thing that I'm talking about. Okay. That's all I have for you guys. I think I don't have that much for you guys. If you guys have any recommendations on episodes, my husband wants me to do the one that's loosely based off of Jeffrey Dahmer. But I would like to know if anybody else would like to have any specific recommendations. Like I said, I have a list, but obviously you guys are the ones who are watching this. So tell me what you want to see, and I'll give it to you. All right? Well, that's all I have for you guys, and I will see you guys next Thursday. As always, have an amazing rest of your week, and have a safe and fun-filled weekend.